Hello again, Jared Pitts here, and today I'm going to be reading another article by Dr. Ray Peat. This one can be found on his website, raypeat.com, under the article section. And this is part 2 of an article called The Problem of Alzheimer's Disease as a Clue to Immortality. And I did part 1 a long time ago. Well, we'll call it a long time ago. But if we're promising immortality here, then not so long ago. A year or two. But if you haven't listened to that one, I would start there and then pick up with this. The first section here is section 5 because parts 1 through 4 were in part 1. So before I get into this, just want to remind you about my website, MissouriHealthCoach.com. If you need help in your health journey, I would love to help you out with that. You can book a 15-minute consultation over there on MissouriHealthCoach.com, a free 15-minute consultation to see how I can help you in your health journey. Some of the things that I've been able to work with clients in the recent past are Crohn's and bowel inflammation, autoimmune issues, and then your standard symptoms that no one likes to have, like a lack of sleep, libido, and things of this nature. You can also use my links in the description to purchase some of these supplements that Dr. Peat has written and researched and shared with us about, like aspirin, vitamin K2, vitamin D, and things of this nature. And so you can use my links to get a certain percentage off a couple of different companies like Health Natura. And again, that helps support the channel and is greatly appreciated. So, all right, this is how it goes. This first section in this part 2, section 5, is called Hormone Imbalance, Leading to Failure of Protective Inhibition and Alzheimer's Disease. And here's a quote from an author, T. Fujita, and it's got the reference there, but this is the quote. All cell death is characterized by an increase of intracellular calcium, and intracellular being calcium within the cell, versus the opposite being extracellular. Increase of cytoplasmic free calcium may therefore be called the final common path of cell disease and cell death. Aging as a background of disease is also characterized by an increase of intracellular calcium. Diseases typically associated with aging include hypertension, arteriosclerosis, diabetes, mellitus, and dementia. And that's the end of that quote. And again, the reference is right there. All right, the function of energy. Most people are slightly demented now and then. When they are very sleepy or tired or sick or drunk or having hormone imbalance or extreme anxiety state. Sometimes physicians have described people as demented, implying that the condition would never improve when the person was depressed or hypothyroid. If the person has a history of epilepsy or is very old, the physician is more likely to diagnose dementia than if the same loss of mental function occurs in a younger person without a history of nervous disorder. Even people with less education are at increased risk of being diagnosed as quote-unquote demented. Interesting. In 1976, I saw a 52-year-old woman who had the diagnosis of epileptic dementia. After 3 or 4 days of taking progesterone, her mental function returned to the extent that she could find her way around town by herself and could work. A few months later, she returned to graduate school, got straight A's, and a master's degree. A few years later, a man in his 80s showed the classical signs of senile dementia, with childishness, confusion, self-centeredness, and unstable emotions. Sounds like a lot of people these days. A few days after getting a mixture of thyroid, pregnenolone, and progesterone, his mind was again clear. And he was able to work on a research project he had set aside years before. When the body temperature is very much below normal, mental functioning is seriously limited. I think the first question that should be asked about a demented person is, quote, is this the cold brain syndrome or is something else involved? End quote. When it is known that the brain has shrunken drastically and filled up with plaques and developed gliosis, gliosis being malformed glial cells, essentially, glial cells that aren't normal, right? You can add osis, that Latin suffix, to the end of most things, meaning it's diseased, right? We know that something more than a quote-unquote cold brain is involved, but we don't know how much function could be regained if the hormones were normalized. Every moment a malfunction probably leaves its structural mark. Early or late, it is good to prevent the functional errors that lead to further damage, and to give the regenerative systems an opportunity to work. Before the final quote-unquote calcium death, described above by Fujita, there are many opportunities for intervening to stop or reverse the process. The older the person is, the more emphasis should be put on protective inhibition rather than immediately increasing energy production. Magnesium, carbon dioxide, sleep, red light, and naloxone might be appropriate at the beginning of therapy. Okay, and we don't want to gloss over that. That is very important. The older the person is, the more emphasis should be put on protective inhibition rather than immediately increasing energy production. And this is the mistake a lot of people make. They find something that they think is good, and maybe it is, to increase energy production. That's what a lot of what Dr. Peat talks about, right? Is oxidative metabolism, how to increase this. And when you increase oxidative metabolism, when you increase energy production, you increase nutritional demands. And if people aren't getting the appropriate nutrition to begin with, increasing energy production is probably not a good idea right off the bat. So a lot of people make this mistake and then have more issues, and then they blame it on the on different things, right? I mean, you go 100 different routes there, but they blame it, there's a fall guy, and it's probably not the appropriate person or appropriate thing, as it were. Okay, moving on. The resting state of a cell is a highly energized state. To the old Pavlovians, the resting state existed at 2 energy levels, and they applied the term quote-unquote protective inhibition generally to the depleted state, parabiosis, that occurs in exhaustion or coma. But I am using the phrase in a more general sense that seems reasonable now that the concept of quote-unquote excitotoxic injury has become current. I mean it to include everything which protects against excitotoxic injury. This definition, therefore, has the virtue of being biochemically and physiologically very specific, while retaining the functional and therapeutic significance that it had for the Pavlovians. My book, Mind and Tissue, and this is Dr. Peat speaking, of course, and the chapter, A Quote-Unquote Unifying Principle in Generative Energy, discuss the idea of the resting state and protective inhibition. So if you have not read his books, they're becoming more available these days. There are places that you can purchase them. So highly recommend getting those books and reading those. You will not regret it. Ordinary healthy sleep is an example of restorative protective inhibition. The energy charge, including levels of ATP, creatine phosphate, and glycogen storage, regulates many restorative enzyme systems. I have suggested, and there's a reference here, how the entropy sensitivity or cold inactivation of an enzyme could be involved in shifting the brain toward a state of inhibition. A recent publication by J.H. Bennington and H.C. Heller called Restoration of Brain Energy Metabolism as the Functions of Sleep, and there's the reference, has proposed that reduction of energy charge and depolarization of cells act through adenosine secretion to restore glycogen stores. Since glycogen stores decrease with aging, this work supports the idea that protective inhibition is weakened with aging. And there's another reference for an article, I believe, called The Effect of Hypoxia on Glycogenolysis and Glycolysis Rates in the Rat Brain. And it has this quote from that article. The conditions that have been demonstrated to stimulate adenosine release from neural tissue represent either increases in metabolic demand, activation of excitatory receptors, or decrease in metabolic supply. Hypoxia, ischemia, hypoglycemia. Then we have another quote from this source. In the brain, adenosine stimulated increases in potassium conductance produce hyperpolarization, thereby reducing neuronal responsiveness. Adenosine release is triggered globally in response to changes in cerebral energy homeostasis. A number of findings provide indirect support for the hypothesis that glycogen stores are depleted during waking and restored during sleep. Reduced availability of glycogen to astrocytes must increase adenosine release, because ATP concentration is 100-fold greater than AMP concentration. A minute decrease in cellular energy charge is translated into a large proportional increase in extracellular adenosine concentration. And we'll dig into what all this means here. The term quote-unquote functional quiescence and go quiescence are similar in meaning to the resting state. I think of cells in the state of go quiescence as being stem cells, waiting for use in regeneration. But I don't subscribe to the idea that they can't be reconstituted from functioning, differentiated cells. In plants, de-differentiation is achieved fairly easily, and in the study of animal cells, the trend in that direction seems very obvious, though many people keep saying that it just isn't possible. In general, the things such as lipid peroxidation or calcium influx, which cause cell replication at one level, cause cell death at a higher level. So what he's kind of getting at here is that a lot of people believe that you have stem cells, and stem cells can kind of become different cells, right? And you have different types of stem cells, and different types of stem cells maybe have more variability in what they can become. And once they become that cell, let's say a liver cell, then it's kind of, that's the end of its life. But he's talking about their ability to de-differentiate, meaning the ability to become a stem cell again, right? Energy to resist stress makes quiescence possible. And quiescence is just at rest, essentially, and prevents the deterioration of cells of the sort that occurs in aging. And we have a reference here, and here's a quote from this article called Cellular Aging and Energetic Factors. And here's the quote. Experiments performed with endothelial cells in the context of the ischemia, reperfusion, toxicity of free radicals also offer good examples of the impact of cell energy on cell resistance to the toxic molecules. If a supplement of energy is given, the toxic effect of the free radicals is much reduced. The specific approaches of this orientation to energize but quiet the brain are diametrically opposed to some of the quote-unquote therapies for Alzheimer's disease that have been promoted recently by the drug industries. Things to increase stimulation, especially to increase cholinergic excitation, even the excitotoxic amino acids themselves and their analogs, and estrogen, which is a multiple brain excitant, proconvulsant, excitotoxic promoter, and anti-memory agent. Those product-centered publications stand out distinctly from the actual research. There are many energy-related vicious circles associated with aging, but the central one seems to be the fat thyroid estrogen free radical calcium sequence, in which the ability to produce stabilizing substances, including carbon dioxide and progesterone, is progressively lost, increasing susceptibility to the unstable, unsaturated fats. Okay, that was a lot, but in summary, the idea is that you need energy to be at rest. Okay? And so, for example, we've talked a lot about this with like different muscles. And you can see this very notably in what's called the Achilles tendon reflex test, where you hit the Achilles tendon, like you might have your, you might be standing and have your foot, I have a couch right behind me, I could probably show you, but have your foot up and someone will hit your Achilles tendon like with the butt end of a butter knife, or with like one of those reflex hammers, and you'll notice your foot will react just like any reflex that you might have, like when the doctor hits your knee and all that good stuff. But then you'll see how fast your foot will come back to the resting state. And if you're hypothyroid, then it eases back ever so slowly. And this is because your body doesn't have enough energy. It can't create enough energy to relax because it takes energy to relax. And so that's what it is kind of talking about here. So just something to keep in mind as we're going through here. All right, this next section is called Effects of Estrogen and Unsaturated Fatty Acids. Estrogen production is facilitated when tissue is cooler, and it lowers body temperature. Estrogen and the endorphins act together in many ways, including the behavior of estrus, and naloxone, the antagonist of morphine and the endorphins, raises body temperature, and in other ways opposes estrogen. Naloxone has been found to improve the symptoms of demented people, and I have seen it quickly and dramatically improve the mental clarity of a 60-year-old woman who had used estrogen. It, like clonidine, the anti-adrenaline drug, is a good candidate for controlling the hot flashes and other symptoms of menopause. In various degenerative brain conditions, blood clotting has been implicated, either as a cause or a complication. Many people are promoting unsaturated oils for their quote-unquote anti-clotting value, in spite of the older literature showing that they inhibit proteolytic enzymes and slow clot removal. Several newer publications have revealed other aspects of their involvement in thrombus formation. A.J. Honor et al., in an article called The Effects of Changes in Diet on Lipid Levels and Platelet Thrombus Formation in Living Blood Cells, states that corn oil caused platelets to be more sensitive to ADP. Although there is a lot of talk about quote-unquote membrane fluidity as a desirable thing and the loss of unsaturated lipids in the aged brain, there are some interesting observations related to quote-unquote viscosity in Alzheimer's disease. The platelets of Alzheimer's patients are less viscous, and lipids extracted from the brain are more fluid and contain 30% less cholesterol than normal, on a molar basis in relation to phospholipids. And there's the reference. In general, lipid peroxidation causes cellular viscosity to increase, apparently by causing cross-linking of proteins, but I think the significance of the decreased cholesterol relates to its significance as precursor to pregnenolone and progesterone, and to the known association with Alzheimer's disease of a variant form of the cholesterol transporter protein APOE, which I suppose is a slightly less stable molecular form that is more susceptible to malfunction in stress. The extracellular matrix is a major factor in the function and stability of brain cells. And there's a study right here. It's called The Concept of Trophic Units in the Central Nervous System. And it says any factor producing edema tends to disrupt the extracellular matrix. And there's some references. Seizures are known to be promoted by estrogen, by unsaturated fats, and by lipid peroxidation, and to cause an increase in the size of the free fatty acid pool in the brain. Prolonged seizures cause nerve damage in certain areas, especially the hippocampus, thalamus, and neocortex. And there's a study. Dementia is known to be produced by prolonged seizures. Prenatal exposure to estrogen, to oxygen deficiency, or to unsaturated fats decreases the size of the brain at birth. There is apparently a requirement for saturated fats during development, and there are several studies. And this one's called Importance of Exogenous Saturated Fatty Acids During Brain Development and Myelination in Mice. Under the influence of estrogen or unsaturated fats, brain cells swell and their shape and interactions are altered. Memory is impaired by an excess of estrogen. Estrogen and unsaturated fat and excess iron kill cells by lipid peroxidation, and this process is promoted by oxygen deficiency. The fetus and the very old have high levels of iron in the cells. Estrogen increases iron uptake. Estrogen treatment produces elevation of free fatty acids in the blood and lipid peroxidation in tissues. This tends to accelerate the accumulation of lipofuscin, age pigment. Lactic acid, the production of which is promoted by estrogen, lowers the availability of carbon dioxide, leading to impairment of blood supply to the brain. And this is what, again, a lot of people don't know, that in order to oxygenate your body, you need carbon dioxide. This is not just a byproduct of our body that needs to be breathed out. It's extremely important in oxygenating our cells. And this is why a lot of people have success with things like the Buteyko method. So if you haven't looked into that, then it might be a good idea. Okay, and before I go on, right, we can see this cascade of physiological responses to these things, and you can see why, and I feel like I bring this up every video, but these things, these inflammation cycles, they have a type of amplification process where the more time you exist in this inflamed state, in this excitotoxic state, kind of the worse it gets, right? Because you can see how these things amplify each other. And this is why it requires intervention of some kind on your part. You can't just keep doing the same things and expect different results, right? Estrogen stimulates cell division, but can also increase the rate of cell death. Unsaturated fatty acids can also stimulate or kill. Both estrogen and unsaturated fats promote the formation of age pigment, which is that lipofuscin he's been referencing. Besides increasing the free fatty acid concentration, estrogen possibly depresses the level of cholesterol, both of which are changes seen in the senile brain. And this is, you have all these paradoxes in in mainstream medicine, we'll call it. But one of these paradoxes is that you are less likely to have a lot of specific problems when you have a level of cholesterol at a particular age that is higher than what they're prescribing statins for. And so you can see here it's talking about estrogen depressing the level of cholesterol, right? And this is how they use these things. They've conditioned the population to believe that cholesterol is this terrible thing. Surprise, it's the precursor to all your your sex hormones, right? Cholesterol gets converted into pregnenolone and progesterone, and it's so necessary for every function in the body. But they've associated it with heart disease, and so they can say, look, estrogen lowers your cholesterol. It's gotta be good, guys. Just take it. Okay. Association. All right. And I was just talking to someone about this. Like, just look at basic physiology, and you can refute the majority of what comes out of mainstream medicine and alternative medicine for that matter. All right. Estrogen causes massive alterations of extracellular matrix and seems to promote dissolution of microtubules, as calcium does. Unsaturated fats increase calcium uptake by at least some brain cells. And there is a reference. Unsaturated fats, like estrogen, increase the permeability of blood vessels. The unsaturated fat causes edema of the brain, inhibits choline uptake, blocking acetylcholine production. And if you haven't listened to his article on the sympathetic versus parasympathetic then it'd be a good idea, because again, that's another one of those things they try to set up as this black and white thing, sympathetic bad, parasympathetic good, but it gets into it in that article. Definitely a good read. Progesterone is a nerve growth factor produced by glial cells, oligodendrocytes. It promotes the production of myelin, protects against seizures, and protects cells against free radicals. It protects before conception, during gestation, during growth and puberty, and during aging. It promotes regeneration. Its production is blocked by stress, lipid peroxidation, and an excess of estrogen and iron. Okay, so you can see why progesterone is talked about so much from Dr. Peat as this nervous system, this brain protectant, right? Promoting the production of myelin, this protective factor in your entire nervous system. Protects against seizures, right? Another nervous system, at least that's how it manifests itself. Issue. Protects against free radicals. And again, why does a woman's progesterone go up so high during pregnancy? I mean, it is a massive amount. And estrogen goes up a little bit at the very beginning, right? But you also have this massive, massive spike in progesterone that protects against that increase of estrogen. Aspirin protects against iron toxicity, clot formation, and reduces lipid peroxidation while blocking prostaglandin formation. Aspirin and other anti-inflammatory drugs taken for arthritis have been clearly associated with a reduced incidence of Alzheimer's disease. Aspirin reduces the formation of prostaglandins from arachidonic acid. Unsaturated fatty acids, but not saturated fatty acids, are signals which activate cell systems. Many different stimuli can induce cell activity, cell death, or change to another cell type. A quote-unquote deficiency of polyunsaturated fatty acid leads to altered rates of cellular regeneration and differentiation, a larger brain at birth, improved function of the immune system, decreased inflammation, decreased mortality from endotoxin poisoning, lower susceptibility to lipid peroxidation, increased basal metabolic rate and respiration, increased thyroid function, later puberty, and decreases other signs of estrogen dominance. All right, and all of that caused by a deficiency of polyunsaturated fatty acids, in case you missed that, right? And he's got deficiency in quotes for a reason, right? Because it's only a deficiency because mainstream medicine says that you need a particular amount of polyunsaturated fatty acids. Just like they say you need vitamin K as a baby, right? Oh, you've got a deficiency because it's not what we think. It's not the amount that we think you should have. People really have, I think, a skewed view of the body, and it's just amazing how the body was created, in my opinion, that we try to intervene on these things, lower cholesterol, raise vitamin K2. Oh no, your baby has jaundice, just randomly after, it's injected with this massive amount of vitamin K. I mean, it's just a mess what's happening in the medical system. Okay, none of this is advice. All of this is just conjecture. Use it for your own research. When dietary PUFA are not available, the body produces a small amount of unsaturated fatty acid, mead acids, but these do not activate cell systems in the same way that plant-derived PUFAs do, and they are the precursors for an entirely different group of prostaglandins. All right, this next section called vitamin A and the steroids. In a variety of cell types, vitamin A functions as an estrogen antagonist, inhibiting cell division and promoting or maintaining the functioning state. It promotes protein synthesis, regulates lysosomes, and protects against lipid peroxidation, or lipofuscin, right? Just as stress and estrogen toxicity resemble aging, so does a vitamin A deficiency. While its known functions are varied, I think the largest use of vitamin A is for the production of pregnenolone, progesterone, and the other youth-associated steroids. One of vitamin E's important functions is protecting vitamin A from destructive oxidation. Although little attention has been given to the effects of unsaturated fats on vitamin A, their destruction of vitamin E will necessarily lead to the destruction of vitamin A. The increased lipid peroxidation of old age represents a vicious circle in which the loss of the antioxidants and vitamin A leads to their further destruction. To produce pregnenolone, thyroid, vitamin A, and cholesterol have to be delivered to the mitochondria in the right proportion and sufficient quantity. Normally, stress is balanced by increased synthesis of pregnenolone, which improves the ability to cope with stress. Lipid peroxidation, resulting from the accumulation of unsaturated fatty acids, iron, and energy deficiency, damages the mitochondria's ability to produce pregnenolone. When pregnenolone is inadequate, cortisol is overproduced. When progesterone is deficient, estrogen's effect is largely unopposed. When both thyroid and progesterone are deficient, even fat cells synthesize estrogen. A lot there, but I'm trying to remember the quote from Dr. Peat, but he talks about once you have corrected a lot of your thyroid issues, if you're supplementing progesterone, the amount that you would need to supplement goes down significantly. And a lot of the reasoning being in that last paragraph. You can see why that would be. This next section is called The Nature of Alzheimer's Disease. Although Alzheimer's disease, until recently, referred to a certain type of organic dementia occurring in people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, pre-senile dementia, structural similarities seen in senile dementia have caused the term to lose its original meaning. Alzheimer's, sclerosis of blood vessels, and even the death of nerve cells are sometimes neglected in favor of the more stylish ideas, emphasizing certain proteins that cause the tangles and plaques. Until recently, the quote-unquote tangles were commonly interpreted as the debris left after the death of a cell, rather than as one of the processes causing the death of the cell. Alzheimer-type dementia is different from other dementias, but it overlaps with them, and with age-related and stress-related changes in other organs. Physical signs seen in autopsy of Alzheimer's disease. 1. Death of neurons, increase of glial cells. 2. Amyloid plaques, extracellular, associated with a particular variant of a polypoprotein E, the epsilon 4 allele. 3. Fibrillary tangles, intracellular or remaining after the rest of the cell has disappeared. 4. Amyloid in blood vessels. Functional and biochemical observations. 1. The mitochondrial energy problem, cytochrome oxidase and its regulation. Body temperature, pulse rate, cycle disturbance, lipid peroxidation, respiratory defect, altered amino acid uptake, memory impairment, dominance of the excitatory systems versus the inhibitory adenosine, GABA, progesterone, pregnenolone system. Increased calcium uptake, which is associated with lipid peroxidation and cell death. Increased cortisol and DHEA. Number 2. Deposit of abnormal proteins such as transthyretin amyloid, albumin binding of PUFA versus transport of thyroid and retinol. Beta-glucuronidase increases, depositing estrogen in cells. And there's references there. Number 3. And remember, these are functional and biochemical observations of Alzheimer's disease. Abnormally phosphorylated tau proteins. Association with the variant form of ApoE. Tau microtubule organizing proteins. Microtubules are involved in transporting cholesterol. Phosphorylation by the kinase system, regulated by PUFA. The intermediate filaments are generally stress associated. 4. ApoE in cytoplasm involved in cholesterol delivery for pregnenolone synthesis as in the adrenal. Its expression regulated by thyroid, regulation of the side chain cleaving enzymes, regulation of the cholesterol intake, and conversion to pregnenolone by the endosipine receptor / GABA receptor, modified by progesterone. This next section is called an example of a regulatory problem. Vegetable oil suppresses the thyroid, increasing estrogen. Estrogen and calcium depolymerize microtubules. Microtubule transport for ApoE, transthyretin, thyroid, and cholesterol for pregnenolone synthesis is disrupted. Transthyretin and ApoE accumulate unused and deposit in blood vessels around nerves and in cytoplasm. Pregnenolone and progesterone deficiency, aggravating thyroid deficiency, causes memory loss, destabilization of nerve cells, failure of myelin formation, and excess cortisol synthesis. Free radicals in calcium cause multiple cell injuries, including nerve death. Estrogen is released by elevated beta-glucuronidase. Imbalances of other steroids, including cortisol and DHEA, develop as cells compensate for pregnenolone deficiency, causing shifts in balance of glial cells. Hypothyroidism, estrogen excess, free unsaturated fats cause increased vascular permeability and brain edema, protein leakage, and alteration of the matrix. Part 8 is called Structure as a Regulatory System, an emerging vision of pervasive epigenesis. In the introduction, I mentioned that membranous regulation and genetic determination should be considered as defunct theories. What I've been saying about self-actualizing systems and the factors that disrupt them derives from a view of cell function that has been developing since the 1920s. Around 1940, a Russian biochemist, Oparin I think, proposed that the enzymes of glycolysis were bound to the structure of the cell when they were not in use, and they were quote-unquote desorbed under the conditions that required abundant glycolysis. Knowing that concept, in 1970 I proposed that the cell water itself underwent a transition under such conditions, which could include increased temperature, reduced oxygen, or nervous or hormonal stimulation. Activation of glycolysis is usually explained by the availability of regulatory substances such as ammonia, phosphate, and NAD, and many biochemists were content to understand cells in terms of the test tube models. But in the last few years, it has become clear that some of these basic regulatory molecules do bind to structural components of the cell. And here's a reference by T. Hennix. Although the details aren't clear, it is known that hormones and other factors stabilize and destabilize RNA, and that during some of these events, relevant enzymes bind to the RNA. When these facts are combined with the information that is accumulating on splicing and modification of RNA and the copying of RNA back into DNA, the hereditary system is seen to be much more flexible than it was believed to be. And he has an article on genetics. I believe I've recorded that one, so that would be a good place to go if you want to read more about that. But you probably understand, and I hope more people are waking up to understanding that this whole genetics concept and how permanent they try to make it out to be is really to push an agenda, right? I mean, they're trying to make people believe that they get particular diseases because of their genetics, and we have to wake up and realize that this is just a big scam trying to get people to pay for a pill because, well, they you can just shirk the responsibility for anything if it's imprinted in your genetics, right? Well, I have zero control over that, so yep, give me whatever pill you got. I don't care what the side effects are, and I don't care what other pills I got to take because I took that pill. There's nothing I can do. What can I do? Because it's my genetics, right? All right, well, maybe we have more control over the outcome than what we're led to believe. So, a global change of state is able to steer each part of the process continuously. In this way, the cell resembles an analog rather than a digital control system. Each part is momentarily guided rather than waiting for quote-unquote feedback. Where before cellular quote-unquote regulatory mechanisms referred to certain feedback mechanisms based on interactions of randomly diffusing molecules, the new understanding of the cell sees a highly structured system in which very little is random, and the cell's adaptive possibilities, instead of being limited to a certain number of genetic switches, are shaped by every imaginable environmental influence. That is a beautiful sentence. The cell structure, far from being quote-unquote read out of the genome, is sensitively reshaped constantly by processes that incorporate some of the environment in establishing each new stability. The old model geneticists have been forced to admit that the genes can't specify everything in the organism's structure, and it has the brain's complexity that forced this recognition that certain things are developed quote-unquote epigenetically. But the new fact that most biologists are reluctant to accept is that the structure of the cell itself is developed very largely on the basis of information received from the environment, that is, quote-unquote, epigenetically. And even that term, they find out that genetics are more variable and malleable, and they have to still keep that iron grip on us with the term genetics inside of the word epigenetics, right? Making it feel less malleable than it is. Anyway, traditionally, epigenesis has meant that the form of an embryo or organism didn't pre-exist or wasn't completely specified by the genes. That is, it has had to do with the relationships between cells. It involved a recognition that, quote, cells are clever enough to design an organism, end quote. It is a significant step beyond that to the recognition that, quote, cells are clever enough to redesign themselves to meet situations never seen before, end quote. Biologists working with bacteria and yeasts have seen them adapt in non-random ways to novel conditions. Quote-unquote directed mutations are impossible according to the quote-unquote central dogma that has the support of textbooks and most biology professors, but they do occur in those single-celled organisms. Barbara McClintock showed that in corn, her mobile genes were mobilized by stress. Although this isn't exactly quote-unquote directed mutation, it is an example of a mechanism for increasing adaptation when adaptation is needed. There is a certain type of enzyme which makes specific cuts in the DNA chain. Biotechnologists find them convenient for their purposes, but their presence serves physiological purposes, presumably in all organisms, like those described by McClintock in corn. During the terminal stress that produces the special kind of cell death known as apoptosis, these enzymes make confetti of the genome. Poisons such as estrogen, unsaturated fatty acids, or even radiation produce different effects at different doses. Low doses typically stimulate cell division. Larger doses produce changes of cell type and altered states of differentiation. And finally, adequate doses produce apoptotic cell death. There is a special ideology around apoptosis, which holds that it is quote-unquote genetically programmed, implying that whenever it occurs in the brain, it was destined to happen sooner or later. But in fact, quote-unquote growth factors of various sorts can prevent it. It is increasingly clear that it represents excessive stress and deficient resources. The involvement of the genetic apparatus in differentiation and radical adaptation suggests that the quote-unquote epigenetic resources of cells are unlimited. Just kind of had a thought. Isn't it interesting that there's this whole idea of evolution and things changing drastically and adapting, right? That's a huge part of it, adaptation. But then when it comes to our bodies and our cells' ability to do this type of thing, completely shut down, right? And of course they'll say, well, time plays a big factor in it. But anyway, compartmentalization, I think that's the key to redirecting what people understand to be true and possible even. The changes that are known to be produced by the poisons that we are habitually exposed to are exactly the changes that occur in the aging brain. As I scan over hundreds of studies that define the effects of estrogen, unsaturated fats, excess iron, and lipid peroxidation, my argument seems commonplace, even trivial, except that I know that it clearly relates to therapies for most of the degenerative diseases, and that the great culture machine is propagating a different view at several points that are essential for my argument. They are advancing a myth about human nature, so I will advance a counter-myth. At the time people were growing their large brains, they lived in the tropics. I suggest that in this time, before the development of grain-based agriculture, they ate a diet that was relatively free of unsaturated fats and low in iron, based on tropical fruits. I suggest that the Boskop skull from Mount Kilimanjaro was representative of people under those conditions, and that just by our present knowledge of the association of brain size with longevity, they, as various quote-unquote golden age myths claim, must have had a very long lifespan. As people moved north and developed new ways of living, their consumption of unsaturated fats increased, their brain size decreased, and they aged rapidly. Neanderthal relics show that flaxseed was a staple of their diet. And this is why we have so many people with Neanderthal type behavior and actions, because they are nutritionally deficient and their environment is terrible. Even living in the tropics, there are many possibilities for diets rich in signal disrupting substances, including iron, and in high latitudes there are opportunities for reducing our exposure to them. As a source of protein, milk is uniquely low in its iron content. Potatoes, because of the high quality of their protein, are probably relatively free of toxic signal substances. Many tropical fruits, besides having relatively saturated fats, are also low in iron, and often contain important quantities of amino acids and proteins. In this context, Jean Calment's lifelong daily consumption of chocolate comes to mind. As she approaches her 121st birthday, she is still eating chocolate, though she has stopped smoking and drinking wine. The saturated fats in chocolate have been found to block the toxicity of oils rich in linoleic acid, and its odd proteins seem to have an anabolic action. If we really take seriously even the traditional sort of epigenesis, and especially if we accept the deeper idea of epigenesis on the level of cellular structure and function, we have to see the organism as a sort of quote-unquote whirlwind of cells, made up of whirlwinds of atoms, in Vernadsky's phrase, in which our way of life sets the boundaries within which our cells will restructure themselves. The random production of free radicals, rather than acting only by way of genetic damage or protein cross-linking, is also able to act as a signaling process. That is, on a strictly physiological level. An excess of unsaturated fatty acids itself constitutes a massive distortion of the regulatory systems, but it also leads to distortions in the quote-unquote eicosanoid system and the increasingly uncontrolled production of free radicals, and to changes in energy, thyroid activity, and steroid balance. The aging body, rather than being like a car that needs more and more repairs until it collapses from simple wear, is more like a car traveling a road that becomes increasingly rough and muddy until the road becomes an impassable swamp. The suggested therapy is a correction of the signaling process rather than the quote-unquote genetic surgery, transplantation, etc., which is the pessimistic implication of the doctrine that oxidative damage is simply a matter of wear and tear, somatic mutations, and cross-linking. Those problems are repairable, and our emphasis should be on the production of energy and the avoidance of the conditions that allow the undesirable signals to accumulate. The absence of cancer on a diet lacking unsaturated fats, the increased rate of metabolism, decreased free radical production, resistance to stress and poisoning by iron, alcohol, endotoxin, alloxin, and streptozotocin, etc., improvement of brain structure and function, decreased susceptibility to blood clots, and lack of obesity and age pigment on a diet using coconut oil rather than unsaturated fats indicates that something very simple can be done to reduce the suffering from the major degenerative diseases, and that it is very likely acting by reducing the aging process itself at its physiological core. And that's the end of this Alzheimer's Part 2 article. Highly suggest you read it several more times. There is a lot to unpack there. But anyway, I'd love to hear what you think. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, share this with friends, and not just sharing it, but unpacking it for them as you better understand it. All right, until next time, guys, God bless.